comes on at about 6:30 in the evening when the kids are watching. They think, wait a minute, why do I have to put up with this? And how would I be able to register a complaint when it's a giant media and entertainment corporation wants it this way? What chance do I have?
But that raises the question
with my own children. And I think, well, maybe a bit less moral relativism might be a good thing.
Yeah.
And I say good on them. Why not?
But what about the sort of other piece of what you just said, which is that it is not inevitable that religious motivation be primarily an engine on the right? And in a way, it's ironic, Mark, given what you had said before about its origins. Are there signs, in fact, that we may already have passed through the era in which religiosity is almost automatically a source of reaction, and that now you see religiously people of faith who feel that the environment is also a religious issue, who feel that aid to Africa is a religious issue, and maybe to some extent we're already talking about a social anachronism?
Yeah, well, certainly there are signs of that, and one hears reports about it. I've had a little contact with some of those people. When my book came out, I did a lot of interviews on NPR, and they were only interested in one question, which was, isn't it the case that there's no essential difference between Osama bin Laden and George Bush? When I answered no, they cut to Morning Report, and were not particularly interested in talking about it anymore. But it turns out that there are radio stations, evangelical radio stations, where the people are interested now in essentially divesting from politics. Their argument is that it's not that we're right or left anymore. If anything, we're probably on the right. But we do think that politics has become an idol that has pushed out the fundamental gospel message. So I showed up on some of these radio shows, and they wanted to talk about what really saves us from fear. Is it Thomas Hobbes and the modern state that prevents us from feeling fear and having to lock our doors? Or is it what St. Paul says in Galatians about being from hope and fear set free? And we end up having a discussion about these scriptural verses. Intellectually serious, much more penetrating than the NPR reviews, and serious about centering the evangelical movement on spiritual matters and away from politics altogether.
Which would be going back to the way things were before, when quietism was the norm among evangelicals. I mean, in a way, that's a return to the norm, I suppose.
Yeah.
Well, but nonetheless, on a couple of things that concern me very much, and I'm sure many others of us here, though it wouldn't be too terrible if only I cared. But anyway, Darfur and the refugees from the famine and tyranny crisis in North Korea, the people out there doing things about that are almost all of them conservative Christians. It has to be admitted.
Yeah.
And the same is true of the anti-slavery and anti-people trafficking nexus in Africa. It has to be allowed to stand to their credit.
Shouldn't we even say, for President Bush, that it is not a coincidence that he has done more in terms of humanitarian and developmental issues in Africa than any of his predecessors, and he himself would ascribe that to Christian compassion? Well,
except for, Bob Geldof, as I slightly know, says that in so many words. He's by far the best American president.
And so would Bono.
Bono would agree, but, and who can possibly...
disagree with Bono.
Yeah, Geldof.
End of discussion, right.
It would take someone with great... But I would very humbly register a tiny dissent. I think the attempt to decouple aid from any enterprise that involves teaching about contraception is a great disservice. When it's not as bad as the Vatican policy that says, well, AIDS is bad, but not as bad as contraception. But it's getting along that way. And that's a great disfigurement, I think, of what's otherwise been a very positive presidency.
No, you can say other things, malaria, for example, or he's been very deeply involved. That doesn't figure.
I just wanted to say in response to your point, though, about quietism. I'm not sure that quietism is the default position for evangelical Christianity. The evangelical Christian movement is also central to the abolition of the slave trade in Great Britain. It played a role as well, a non-trivial role in the temperance movement in the United States.
And more broadly in the progressive movement.
In the progressive movement, and therefore... I just want to make the point that it's up and down. There are times when evangelical Christianity is a major political force and times when it fades, and I suspect that sort of fluctuation is not going to change substantially.
And that brings us back, actually, to what we were talking about earlier, this question of religious anthropology. One of the things that has to be said, and Christopher has just admitted, is that religious faith is one thing that puts boots on the ground. That if you need someone to go to North Korea, they're going to do it. If it means getting medicine to people in Africa, they're actually going to do it. It's not just that they hold the right views, but it motivates people to do things. So the question that has to be asked of those who are promoting some fantasy of a fully secular culture is fine, all your views will be right. How will you motivate action? Where people are actually willing to make sacrifices for the good and not simply write an editorial or check off the right box in the ballot or subscribe to the right magazines.
Well, Christopher, I think
that is something that these societies can't answer.
That question is directed to you.
You could add, it's one of the reasons that the CIA is so full of Mormons. At least the Mormons insist that any serious young person goes out as a missionary, learns another language in a dangerous and hazardous environment. These people can later make very good human intelligence agents or so, though they have to disabuse themselves of a couple of theological deformities, I think. And I wonder how the Mormon underwear works out in some of those climates.
It's the problem with having this highly uniform panel here. We don't have any Mormons to answer that.
Let it be conceded, this has a lot more morale to it, I would say. A lot more grit and integrity than the sort of affectless moral equivalence racketeering of some MoveOn.org and NPR.
But let's pursue that a little bit, because I think the upshot of your book is we would all be much better off if we lived in a wholly secular world. In that wholly secular world, where in fact would the fuel come from that Mark was describing that has led to the civil rights movement and led to terrible things as well? Would you just say better off in the end to not have the fuel in either direction?
No, wait a second. I mean, on this, of course it is true that though they came to it extremely late, there's no record of any Christian protest against slavery anywhere in the world because it was so much biblically warranted until the Mennonite petition in Germantown, Pennsylvania, in the 17th century, I believe, before the United States. After that, there's practically nothing till Garrison. And it has to be remembered that the justification for and support for slavery was what was the Christian contribution. The motto of the Confederacy is Deo Vindice, God is with us, and so forth. If they're going to accept the one, they have to accept the other. The American Anti-Slavery Society's membership was tended to be made up of people like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine, who were not believers. And I don't think anyone would say that they had less moral fervor to them than people who can pound a pulpit and wave a holy text.
So in a way, it's sort of the Founding Fathers' one good answer to that question?
No, excuse me, we're not going to run out of conviction when we run out of people who think that God speaks through them, or speaks at all.
No, do you have a similar or different view to that?
No, I think Christopher is certainly right that there are plenty of people with deep conviction who don't see that conviction as coming from God. To me, the relevant question is whether we should be categorizing religion primarily in terms of the theological component of it. Say, well, religious people, those are the people who believe something because they think God thinks so. And on the other hand are people who believe things strongly but are secular, or whether you think the right division is people who just believe things in nearly absolute terms, whether that impulse is a secular impulse or what we would call a religious impulse. So, I mean, the deeply believing communist, for example, if such still exist, which they probably don't, but at the time when they did in large numbers, should we be characterizing that in our conversation as yet another religion with all of the features and demerits of religion, or should we be characterizing that as something distinct and different?
Because the 20th century presumably is the century of absolutist non-religious beliefs, even more than it is the century of absolutist religious beliefs.
Yeah,
unless you call them religious.
Those are the ones that did the big things in the 20th century, and mostly the big bad things.
Yeah, but the case, this is what I say in my book, that they are surrogate religions, is a very strong one. I mean, I've been in North Korea, for example, where the president is a dead man. Kim Jong-il, the dear leader, is only the head of the party and of the army. He's not the head of the state. Head of the state is his dead father, of whom he's a reincarnation. So I describe North Korea as a thanatocracy, or a necrocracy, if you like. Mausolocracy, but carefully note, it's only one short of a trinity. And the only activity allowed to the citizen is to be a member of the congregation. I used to wonder when I was a kid, and forced to attend Christian ceremonies, would heaven really be what they promised, namely eternal praise and thanks? It sounded like hell to me. Well, and now I've seen what it's like. When you get up in the morning and you go to bed at night, all you do is all the time say thank you, groveling, and forced to love someone who, oddly enough, you also fear. So it couldn't be a more religious state.
Well, so wait, are we then saying that the real distinction is not between religious